This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading
Welcome to
publication
Trifle,
of Sherlockian
a weekly podcast about the
since
Sherlock Holmes stories.
1946. Find them online.
It is, of
at
course, a trifle, but there is nothing so
BakerStreetIrregulars.com.
important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 201, Spare No Expense. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we go into the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, you are worth every penny I pay you.
Absolutely. You know, it's difficult, but it's a challenge because now I'm rolling them all up. And, you know, you always get to the end where you've got sort of 49 or 48 cents in and then 2 or 3 sort of roll off on the carpet.
I know.
But it builds character.
And if you put a bunch of those in a sock, they actually work as a really nice weapon against intruders in your house. So try that. From our house to yours.
Well, thank you.
The technical details are as follows. If you would like to sign up for email updates, just go to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and you'll hear from us there. We will update you usually every Wednesday when we send out an update. You can find the show notes for this particular episode, which are what get mailed out, at ihose.co/trifles201. 201st episode. Amazing. We are I Hear of Sherlock on all of the major social networks, and you can certainly email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We appreciate all of your wonderful support, your kind notes, your support of finances, etc., and we look forward to bringing you more of this kind of stuff throughout the month. Well, we are sparing no expense in this episode. You know, Burt, we have talked about Sherlock Holmes and his monetary situation before. You know, the princely rent that Mrs. Hudson has seen, and some of the things that Sherlock Holmes's clients have been up to. But what I thought we might do this time is look at instances where Holmes is traveling, and what's he doing on his travels, and what might or might not get billed to clients, and how that represents the life that Sherlock Holmes lived on the road from time to time.
It's a great subject, and it's also a great indicator of the talents of John Watson. You know, we know from the first time that we meet John Watson that surviving in London is a big issue for him, and it's one of the reasons that he and Sherlock Holmes come together. And that's in fact a big motivation behind their decision to share rooms in Baker Street. But the wonderful thing is that Watson never writes about this. You know, he never, except very, very generally, never writes about details of, he makes general statements like Mrs. Hudson received a princely rent and so on. So it's a wonderful thing because it tells us that Watson was very discriminating and just wanted to get to what he considered really the most interesting features and elements of Sherlock Holmes cases. But Holmes is forever spending money. There's never a case where he needs to wire Mycroft for any funds. He's dispensing shillings to the Baker Street irregulars. And we see that just sort of as a matter of course. For example, in The Twisted Lip, and I know we're going to talk about some examples, but in The Twisted Lip, you know, this is a case where Watson has gone off to this particular location without getting into the story and meets up with Holmes, and that has a sort of a successful conclusion. And then they're back out on the street, and this other case is now about to begin. the case of the man with the twisted lip. And it turns out Holmes has a cab. I think it's a hansom, just sort of, or is it a dog cart? I don't really remember what it is, but it's there. And he steps up into the cart and actually pays off the fellow who's driving it, and off they go. And it's just another case of Holmes. Now, admittedly, perhaps that's, in the great scheme of things, a small expense, but it just shows you another example of Holmes. I wouldn't say profligacy, but he's clearly never worried about money. You know, there's occasionally a time in the cases of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin where the detective discovers that the bank balance is running low and therefore he must take on a case. Not so with Sherlock Holmes. He has locations around the city where he can change. He orders cabs, sends telegrams. He's clearly doing pretty well.
He is. And, you know, it's interesting because he doesn't really travel about that much in the first handful of stories. I mean, it's really only contained to within London itself. You know, maybe a cab over to Brixton or the other side of town or whatnot, or from Bryony Lodge to the church at St. Monica's in the Edgware Road in A Scandal in Bohemia. And so we really don't see him traveling around all that much until we get to, I guess the Boscombe Valley mystery. That was the first case where he heads out into the country. And this would have taken him out. And, you know, a poor, who was it that hired Holmes for the Boscombe Valley mystery? What brought him out there? Holmes wired Watson and basically said, hey, I'm heading to the west of England in connection with the Boscombe Valley mystery. Meet me at Paddington Station. And it's not clear to me from that note how he was engaged in the case.
Well, the problem there, too, is the chronology. You know, the misalignment between the publication of the cases.
True. It was the McCarthys, but I'm scanning it quickly. It's not clear to me just straight off the bat, but Holmes was hired by someone to go out to the west of England in that case. And this was the first instance in the canon, as we read the stories in the order in which they were published, that he heads out there. But it's not until a few stories later in The Speckled Band where Helen Stoner, who had come to consult with Holmes, she did not have control of her own fortune at the time. She said she would as soon as she was married. And he said, I can only say, madam, that I shall be happy to devote the same care to your case as I did to that of your friend. As to reward, my profession is its own reward. But you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to at the time which suits you best. So this is directly in line with what you were saying before, that he wasn't really worried about whether his expenses would be taken care of or not. He was in it for the game, which to me means that he must have had some kind of independent wealth, or was just certain that when he came across a client like the Duke of Holderness from time to time, that these would inevitably cover the expenses that would come to him from these other smaller clients that really just had interesting cases.
Well, you know, this is a lot. I just can't resist pointing this out. This is another great area. You know, we're talking about this, and we hadn't discussed this previously, but it's another area where when you start to get into these kinds of details and questions, well, what were Sherlock Holmes' expenses? you find really interesting grounds for papers and observations if our listeners want to do some writing for something like the Baker Street Journal. So, for example, we generally know that A Study in Scarlet is dated in 1881. At that point, Holmes is very much interested in finding somebody to share the cost of rooms in London. So in 1881, money is an issue. There he is developing the Sherlock Holmes blood type test or the hemoglobin test. So money is an issue then. And we know it's not the first of his cases because while he's been in school, he's already, Watson tells us, been involved in the Gloria Scott. He's been involved in the Musgrave Ritual. But somehow after 1881, and some people, date the speckled band as 1883 and the resident patient is 1886. So now we're into sort of the last half of the 1880s. Somewhere after that, apparently this concern about money disappears. Now, is it possible that a relative passed away and left him an inheritance? Is it possible he's had some reward for a case we don't know anything about? Is it possible that he's had some gift from someone? Is it possible? Is it possible? Is it possible? But it's a wonderful question, isn't it?
It really is. And, the way you framed it, it made me think, well, maybe Holmes worked on that Sherlock Holmes test and worked it all out and got his patents and enjoyed the royalties of that for some years to come.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
I don't know what the records are in terms of blood tests or anything of the like, but it's something that is worth looking into if you want to do the heavy lifting of the research.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of heavy lifting and research, we'll leave you with a little light lifting, listening to this item about someplace you can do some research on your own. Stay tuned. It's all well and good to have a subscription to the Baker Street Journal. In fact, the most recent issue just recently came out and is making its way to mailboxes all over the world. But when you're looking for scholarship past rather than present, the easiest way to go about finding that is with the eBSJ. The eBSJ is a PDF archive that provides a complete set of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 all the way through 2011 on a single DVD in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages spanning the old series, the Christmas annuals, and the new series all the way through 2011. Will there be another eBSJ to update us in the last decade? Well, we certainly hope so. What format will it take? Well, that's up to you to find out. But get the eBSJ version 2 on DVD while it's still around. Find it online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Okay, we're back. We're talking about spare no expense, some of the things that Sherlock Holmes might have been up to, the expenses that he incurred, whether or not we know the actual monetary amounts. And I will say, Bert, that what first kind of pricked my ears up to this particular subject comes from a quote in Wisteria Lodge. John Scott Eccles, is under suspicion for what happened out with Mr. Garcia. And he's convinced of his own innocence, as I think Sherlock Holmes was. But he tells Holmes, as he's trying to light his way to the truth in the matter here, I desire you to spare no expense and no pains to get to the truth. So he's basically giving Holmes carte blanche to do whatever he has to figure out. So let's look at some of the things that Holmes did, not necessarily in this story, but throughout the canon, that would have required some considerable expense.
Well, we've already talked about one, which is cab fares and cab costs and tossing coins around, and another tossing shillings around to the Baker Street irregulars. Christopher Morley observed in his essay about the Blue Carbuncle that he believes Holmes went back and repaired the window damage and the other breakage that's mentioned in a part of that story. But the thing that stands out to me in terms of a real expense is in the Reigate Squires, which some people date to 1887. You know, I always happen to follow the Baring Gould chronology just for convenience. But the interesting thing about the Reigate Squires case and the expense isn't really an expense that's contained in the case itself. It's the start of the case. Holmes is in Lyon. He's just solved some incredible mystery about which Watson will never tell us anything. And he is, as Watson says, knee-deep in telegrams. And there he is at a hotel in France. He had to get there. Clearly he's had, you know, some expenses in whatever it is he's been doing. And, you know, and that sort of parallels another issue, which is theoretically, with relatively little preparation, this is a guy who packs up and goes to Switzerland in The Final Problem, seeking to elude with what we will eventually discover is a remarkable lack of success, the tentacles of Professor Moriarty.
Yeah, and let's not forget, in that very scene, Holmes and Watson let their luggage go on without them. And Holmes said, we'll pick up a couple of carpet bags at the shop there. Well, he left his Italian priest costume there. He had to get a whole new disguise if he was going to become an Italian priest again. So that's money down the drain. Not a Holmesian expense, but a Moriarty expense was engaging the special. Right. Well, you think it's hard and expensive to hire a cab and a cabman to just sit and wait for you to take you out to Kent. Boy, can you imagine what it is to hire a special, as Moriarty did?
What a waste. You know, Moriarty could have patented Uber.
That's great. Similarly, and this one intrigues me as well. The beginning of the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, Holmes kind of dangles a first-class trip in front of Watson. He said, you need a change. Let me suggest you take one. How would Lausanne do, my dear Watson? First-class tickets and all expenses paid on a princely scale. I mean, It's like spring break from Baker Street.
Well, too, though, we do have to remember that I think even in those days, one of the things that drove so many impecunious people in America to have extended voyages in Europe was that the cost of living in France and on the continent was generally significantly less than where they were coming from. Now, I don't know how that – I can imagine it was probably the same in terms of the cost of living in Britain. But still in all, the word princely is the word princely. And here's another case of Sherlock Holmes, you know, throwing around money without, you know, any real clear source to its
although I will say I'll bet that the two of them dined really well when they were on that trip, because recall I guess it was The Noble Bachelor, Holmes prepared something of an Epicurean little cold supper, as Watson called it. He laid this out for Roberts and Simon and the others that were going to join them there. And we've talked about this particular table setting before on this show. He said the cold supper began to be laid out on our humble lodging house mahogany. There were a couple of brace of cold woodcock, a pheasant, a pâté de foie gras pie with a group of ancient and cobwebby bottles, Having laid out all these luxuries, my two visitors vanished away like the genie of the Arabian Nights with no explanation save that things had been paid for and were ordered to this address. So, we talked about Uber just then. Well, this is the DoorDash of Baker Street on a luxury scale.
Yeah, but it also tells us a lot more. I mean, first of all, the reference there is a group of cobwebby bottles. It's not a couple of cobwebby bottles. It's a group of cobwebby bottles. But second of all, he knew what to order. So clearly he has distinguished and expensive tastes. And that could tell us something about the circle in which he moved. It could tell us something about other things in his education. It could tell us something about his background. It could tell us lots of things. But clearly he knew what to order, and there it is.
And as fate would have it, that is the subject of episode 203 of Trifles in just 2 weeks. Stay tuned. In the meantime, this is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
At present it is out of my power to reward you, but in a few weeks I shall be married with control of my own income.
I shall be happy to devote the same care to your case as to that of your friend. As for reward, my profession is its own reward. But you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to at the time which suits you best.